Saddam Hussein sat behind a plain wooden desk on the stage of Al-Khuld Hall, casually puffing on a Cuban cigar. Thick blue smoke drifted upward from his fingers and caught the harsh glare of the studio spotlights. Technicians moved quietly through the aisles to check their lenses and adjust the heavy broadcast cameras. 400 men in one room. On July 22, 1979, these ruling Ba'ath Party members gathered in Baghdad for a standard meeting, totally unaware that many would never leave. Setting up professional television equipment inside a closed political conference in 1979 was an incredibly rare move. Usually, internal government affairs stayed completely hidden behind heavy doors and strict secrecy. But organizers had carefully positioned microphones across the floor and wired the entire room for perfect visibility. They needed pure evidence. His men deliberately created this tape as an instrument of direct blackmail to project pure fear across the country. He needed their faces. Just 6 days earlier, the previous president abruptly stepped down and handed total control of the state directly to Saddam. The officials sitting in the audience knew about this sudden power shift, but they completely misunderstood the agenda for today. Armed guards quietly stepped forward and locked the main exit doors from the outside. Saddam took another slow drag from his cigar and looked calmly at the crowd. He staged the entire spectacle. The cameras filmed Saddam on July 22nd, but the actual reason for this meeting traced back 6 days, to July 16, 1979. Why did the 62-year-old Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr suddenly quit? Officially, they cited health. The old leader had ruled for 11 years. He brought the Ba'ath Party to power in 1968. He signed the oil nationalization. He passed new social laws. But this meant nothing. Saddam Hussein spent the 1970s quietly taking over the country. He placed his relatives at every checkpoint of power. 3 half-brothers took key political roles. Cousins took over military commands. A brother-in-law entered the tightest circle. Saddam built a ruthless security apparatus. Officially, the president resigned due to poor health. In reality, he had entirely lost control over his own guards. Al-Bakr was just a front, but he was about to sign a fatal treaty. Throughout early 1979, Baghdad and Damascus negotiated a total political union. Combining Iraq and Syria created a giant. The new state gained direct access to the Mediterranean Sea. It pooled colossal oil reserves under one flag. This union completely broke the balance of the Middle East. But unification meant sharing power. The Syrian president Hafez al-Assad brought a clear proposal to the table. Assad demanded the role of deputy leader in the new combined state. On the 16th of July, 1979, one man took the 4 main positions in the state. Hafez al-Assad's plan for a unified nation failed entirely. It failed because on the 11th of July, during a council meeting, al-Bakr announced an immediate transfer of power. Saddam Hussein became president of Iraq, chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, leader of the Ba'ath Party, and commander of the armed forces. Foreign diplomats watched the handover and found nothing unusual in the process. The rustle of diplomatic cables going to Washington carried a clear message about a peaceful and highly orderly transition. But the reality behind those closed doors looked completely different. When the old president stood before the council and read his resignation, Muhi Abdul Hussein Mashhadi immediately pushed back. Mashhadi held the rank of council secretary, giving him significant bureaucratic weight inside the regime. He urged the aging leader to take a temporary medical leave instead of handing over complete control. Al-Bakr refused the compromise and stepped down completely. Saddam watched the argument unfold in front of him and quietly marked the secretary as his very first target. Mashhadi thought he was participating in a standard political debate about the future of the Iraqi government. He fundamentally misunderstood the new reality that Saddam had just constructed around the entire ruling party. The legal paperwork formalized a total dictatorship, turning a single administrative objection into a guaranteed death sentence. Nobody inside that room knew what the new president was planning for the emergency Congress exactly 6 days later. Only 6 days remained. How do you destroy an international treaty without saying no? You demand the impossible. Saddam took those 4 top jobs on July 16th for one simple reason. He needed to torpedo the unification talks with Syria. Aides dropped the heavy leather folders onto his desk. Inside lay the draft agreement to merge Syria and Iraq. Saddam opened the documents. He dictated his new terms step by step. He refused any joint military command. He demanded full integration of both national party branches. Then he inserted one specific name to head the unified structure: Michel Aflaq. Aflaq founded the Ba'ath ideology, but a Damascus court had already sentenced him to death. Pushing a condemned fugitive to lead the joint government was the diplomatic equivalent of declaring war. In 1979, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad read the Iraqi counteroffer. He rejected the conditions immediately. The historic alliance collapsed. A national merger died just to protect one official's career, but the danger persisted. President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr was old. His health deteriorated every month. Saddam evaluated the fading president and saw a fatal risk. The country's political elite drove through the streets expecting to divide new cabinet portfolios, but they actually walked straight into a hostage situation. The Syrian merger was completely dead. The old president was gone, and the new leader needed to see his inner circle immediately. Summons went out for an urgent emergency session on July 22nd. 400 party leaders received strict orders to attend. Ministers, regional secretaries, and hardened military commanders gathered at Al-Khuld Hall. They expected a standard bureaucratic briefing about the future direction of the state. Men in tailored suits and military uniforms slowly took their assigned seats in the auditorium. Heavy wooden doors swung shut, and a loud metal click of a turning key echoed near the entrance. Guards securely locked the exits from the outside. This specific venue sat right next to the main presidential palace, which completely excluded any possibility of unauthorized help arriving from the street. The space instantly transformed from a political forum into an inescapable trap. Down on the stage, Saddam Hussein sat alone at a small desk and calmly adjusted the microphones. Technicians deliberately positioned several bulky broadcast cameras in the aisles around the seated delegates. The state television crew frequently recorded these major gatherings, so nobody questioned the thick cables running across the floor. The powerful men expected a predictable speech about total authority. He lit a cigar. They waited for him to speak. How do you paralyze 400 powerful men? You tell them the enemy sits right beside them. Saddam finally broke the heavy quiet. He ignored the expected cabinet posts. Instead, he announced a massive, crushed conspiracy. Elite veterans filled the chairs. Most carried loaded sidearms under their jackets. They expected a standard political briefing. Saddam gave them a psychological execution. He lowered his pitch. His voice sounded artificially sad. It broke mid-sentence. Dead silence swallowed the hall. He played the grieving leader. Treason broke his heart. The delegates exhaled. They imagined distant rivals. They pictured rogue officials in the provinces. They guessed wrong. Saddam tightened the trap. He named the sponsor, Syria. He claimed Damascus funded a shadow faction inside their own Ba'ath party, carefully planning a hostile takeover since 1975. The traitors waited patiently. They used the unification talks to destroy his rule. Danger sat right here. It breathed the hall's air. Saddam raised his hand. He made a sharp gesture. Iraq's top officials stand in a dusty courtyard. They wear expensive tailored suits. Now, their hands grip cold steel. They wait for the command to fire. One bureaucrat shifts his weight. The weapon feels alien in his grip. Dozens of surviving party members form a jagged line beside him. Security officers march 22 condemned men into the yard behind the conference hall. Minutes ago, they sat together. Now, the guards push the accused against a blank wall. Baghdad burns in the July sun. The temperature exceeds 40 degrees Celsius. Guards walk down the row of politicians. They shove assault rifles into their chests. A loaded Kalashnikov weighs almost 4 kilograms. It pulls the arms down. These are career officials who spent their whole lives holding nothing heavier than a fountain pen. The guards shout a blunt order. A sharp metallic clank of steel bolts echoes across the yard. The men chamber their rounds. Refusal carries an immediate price. Anyone who drops the weapon will instantly swap places with the targets. Saddam binds his elite through raw physical murder. The surviving party members raise their weapons. They level the heavy barrels at their former colleagues. How to process dozens of death verdicts in one day? Those 22 men faced guns after trials lasting mere hours. They used pre-written lists. Clerks already stamped the paperwork. Verdicts sat on desks. Saddam offered brief praise. The cameras kept recording. Couriers shipped tapes to military bases. Behind the hall, work began. Guards held 68 arrested officials. Interrogators asked no questions. A standard treason trial takes months. This tribunal finished before lunch. Judges signed 22 death sentences in a couple of hours. The math was simple. No evidence, no defense, just rubber stamps. The other 46 men avoided the courtyard. Guards dragged them to underground cells. The remaining accused received long terms in concrete state prisons where almost no one survived. Muhi Abdul Hussein Mashhadi walks slowly toward the podium. His movements are jerky. His eyes look completely empty. The entire chain of rapid death sentences started right here, with one broken man standing at a microphone. He leans into the wooden stand. He begins to speak. His voice is monotonous. A completely flat sound echoes through the massive hall. This was not the vocal party leader they knew. The guards had turned him into a shell. Visible marks of interrogation covered his skin. Saddam needed him to look destroyed. The physical state of the man was the real message. The terror was now legal. It showed everyone exactly what awaited the opposition. The actual words he read barely mattered. Mashhadi mechanically confessed to a massive plot. He stated that the conspiracy was financed by Syria to overthrow the government. He listed dates, locations, and secret meetings with foreign officials. The details were highly specific, yet the delivery felt entirely rehearsed. As the Secretary General of the Revolutionary Command Council, his testimony provided the perfect narrative to justify a total purge. The truth of his claims meant nothing. The confession merely served as the formal starting gun for the repressions. Only 11 days had passed since his last confident speech. Mashhadi stared at the microphone. He read the first name. What happens when your name sounds? You freeze. A guard steps forward. Your career ends. Mashhadi droned on. Every spoken syllable triggered a practiced extraction sequence. The arrest followed a strict pattern. Mashhadi named an official. He alleged secret ties to Syria. The accused sat paralyzed. Baghdad security agents approached. They grabbed his arms. They pulled him up. Dead silence blanketed the hall. Heavy wooden chairs scraped loudly across the floor. Agents lifted another official from his seat. Some tried to protest. The guards ignored them. These men had ruled millions. They had signed arrest warrants for years. Today they walked limply under armed escort. The list seemed endless. A second name, a 20th. The entire administrative elite sat in this very room. The purge decapitated the Iraqi government in exactly 1 hour. Mashhadi kept reading. Another name echoed. The guards gripped the next party member by the arms and led him out into the corridor. 68 empty seats. While guards dragged the condemned officials toward an inevitable execution, the surviving politicians desperately tried to stay alive right in their places. The microphone kept broadcasting the list of names, and the physical gaps between the audience members grew wider by the minute. 10 men disappeared into the corridors, then 20, and the remaining politicians realized they needed to act quickly. Men who had sat in quiet dignity just moments before suddenly started screaming at the top of their lungs. They yelled loud pledges of allegiance, hoping their dictator would single out their voices over the rising noise. Total hysteria took over the room as the top functionaries of the Ba'ath Party begged for their lives. The cameras recorded every single moment of this sudden transformation from powerful leaders into terrified subjects. Down at the main stage, Saddam Hussein simply sat at his desk and watched the panic unfold. Thick cigar smoke drifted slowly over his table against the loud backdrop of terrified screams. He took slow drags from his cigar, occasionally wiping his eyes as if the supposed betrayal deeply hurt him. He acted the part of a sorrowful leader who had to make difficult choices for the entire nation. The speaker called out 68 names inside the Al-Khuld hall in Baghdad before he finally stopped reading. Nobody knew who the guards would grab next, so the frantic cheering never stopped for a single second. The ongoing purge wiped out a massive chunk of the Iraqi government right in front of the rolling cameras. By the time the man on stage finally put down his papers, the room looked entirely different. Exactly 68 seats stood empty across the auditorium. The men who shouted loudest inside now stood in the courtyard. They faced their old friends. How do you bind an elite forever? You make them kill their colleagues. Fear fades, blood binds. This was pure social engineering. Guards handed rifles to the survivors. Yesterday, the Revolutionary Command Council ruled the country. Now its members stood as common executioners. Hesitation meant death. Mercy meant treason. These officials had no choice. They took the loaded weapons. The entire group built the Ba'ath Party together. They shared meals. Both sides survived the underground. Now, none of that mattered. The shooters raised their rifles. They took aim. Eyes met across the courtyard. One executioner locked a gaze with his victim. The two men had shared one office for years. Exactly 2 decades of joint work vanished with one final order to fire. Why force accountants and ministers to execute living people? The answer is blood. For party officials who had never seen combat, pulling the trigger became a one-way street. Guards shoved the prisoners against the wall. Officers thrust assault rifles into the hands of civilian administrators. The heavy steel felt alien. Fingers trembled. Bolts clacked sharply in the enclosed courtyard. The thick smell of gun oil hit the air. A military squad works fast. But efficiency meant nothing today. Saddam needed accomplices. He deployed a classic mafia tactic of mutual guilt. You pull the trigger for the boss. You belong to the boss. Saddam claimed the presidency exactly 6 days earlier. Now he dragged his entire government into a shared crime. The surviving politicians were trapped. To speak out against the new regime meant admitting they had personally gunned down their own colleagues. The final command echoed across the yard. Civilian hands squeezed the triggers on July 22, 1979. Empty casings hit the concrete. By sunset, all 22 condemned men lay dead. The 68 people dragged from the hall became just the first wave. The same methods that broke the initial 22 victims now rolled out across the entire country. Saddam declared that a massive treasonous plot threatened the state. Muhi Abdul Hussein Mashhadi had previously opposed the change in power. He had pushed for a political union with Syria. That sealed his fate. But the purge did not stop at the Ba'ath Party elite. By early August, the death lists multiplied. The secret police hunted anyone with ties to Damascus. They looked for critics. They punished silence. A simple lack of enthusiasm for the new president guaranteed an arrest. Executioners worked without pause. Eliminating immediate political rivals was merely the first step of a much larger operation. To establish total dominance, the regime needed to paralyze any independent grassroots organization before it could even form. The terror immediately spilled out of the government quarters into the civilian sector. The Mukhabarat expanded their sweeps across the country. Black cars pulled up to private enterprises and factories. State security agents detained union leaders and businessmen. How do you convince an entire country to forget the rules? You show them one videotape. Instead of burying the evidence in secret archives, state couriers delivered cassette copies directly to government ministries and local branches. The Ba'ath Party once tolerated internal arguments. Regional commands voted. Factions debated over policy. Now the organization became the private weapon of a single man. Branch managers locked their office doors. They drew the curtains. The flickering light of a television screen washed over their faces. They watched the tape from the 22nd of July, 1979. Grainy footage showed the top officials of the Revolutionary Command Council sweating. Guards dragged them out of the hall. The viewers sat completely still. Wiping out the council meant the immediate death of any debate inside the government. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of party members understood the new reality. Fear bypassed street rumors. It arrived on magnetic tape. Every person watching the screen realized their own vulnerability. If the highest leaders vanished in minutes, ordinary cadres meant nothing. The council never voted again. A courier walked into the quiet room and dropped a highly classified memo from the Syrian leader right onto the desk. That single stack of paper proved that the domestic terror had instantly spilled over the national borders. The rules vanished. The bloodbath inside the party hall quickly redrew the entire map of the Middle East. Two neighboring countries with the exact same socialist beliefs suddenly turned into paranoid, heavily armed enemies. Before the arrests happened, there was a real plan to merge both nations into one massive Arab powerhouse. But those quick executions sent a clear message to Damascus that any dream of unification was dead. The grand idea of Arab brotherhood simply took a back seat to the raw personal hatred between the two leaders. Shared interests meant nothing. No one wanted to align with a man who happily slaughtered his own inner circle to keep control. The old handshakes were forgotten. When the brutal trench war with Iran kicked off in 1980, starting an 8-year bloodbath, the previous agreements collapsed. The text of that 1981 memo laid out a strict order. Damascus wanted to drag out the armed conflict and force a regime change. They started sending money and weapons to rebel factions. Syrian intelligence armed Shia Islamist parties that hated everything the secular leadership stood for. To settle the personal score, the Syrian state formally crossed the line and allied itself with Iran, who claimed the newly emptied cabinets. Party ideologues expected swift promotions. They got nothing. Relatives from Tikrit took everything. A small town of 30,000 swallowed Iraq. Generals lost their military commands. Ministers packed up their desks. Cousins walked right in. They sat down. They took over. New names appeared on lucrative state contracts. Heavy gold pens scratched the paper. Socialist economics died quietly. State capitalism took its place. The entire nation became a private family business. His sons Uday and Qusay joined the inner circle. Blood mattered far more than competence. In June 1982, paranoia spiked. The purges resumed. His 3 half-brothers seized the domestic security agencies. The ruling circle shrank again. Fear ruled. Of the 16 command council members who survived the first bloodbath, the second wave left exactly 8.